Welcome. Thanks for joining me today. I am joined by Dr. David W. Congdon, who is the author of a new book we'll be discussing today called Who is a True Christian? Contesting Religious Identity in American Culture. Dr. Congdon is a senior acquisitions editor at the University Press of Kansas and an adjunct instructor at the University of Dubuque Theological Seminary. So thank you so much for joining me.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
I really appreciated this book. I just wanted to say before we get started into the questions how much just the um, careful nature of your research showed off and how thorough it was, and just it was an excellent book on that front. And I really was impressed and really, I mean, I've read some of your other stuff before, of course, so I know you're an excellent scholar, but I it just was a very impressive book, and so I wanted to commend you on what I'm assuming was just mountains of research that required to get into it. So I really appreciated it certainly paid off as well. So I'll
Thank you.
commend you on that. But we'll dive into some of the questions. So in the preface to the book, you mentioned how this kind of goes back to the beginnings of your academic career. And so how does this main question that you're working through about what defines true Christianity, how does that relate to some of your other work? I'm familiar with your work on Rudolf Bultmann in particular. And more generally, why do you think this is a question that's important to discuss today?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I appreciate you bringing back my work on Boltzmann in part of this conversation, since I think that a lot of people skip over that little bit in the very beginning of the book. But it actually is pretty important to me. My work on Boltzmann was really an effort to understand how Christianity can change over time while still remaining Christian.
Mhm.
That's fundamentally the question that I was trying to explore in that work, in my earlier work. So I get to put that another way. Um, in my first book, I was asking, what is it about the Christian message that enables it to accommodate such a vast array of times, places, cultures, and ideologies? How can it accommodate all those differences over time? And my argument in that work was that Boltzmann came up with a novel and I think still powerful explanation with his concept of the kerygma. And so in my work on Boltzmann, I pointed out how uh, that his concept of the kerygma functions the same way as the older liberal concept of the essence of Christianity. So I've mentioned that a few times in my earlier write-ins. And that was the origin of this book, because I began to see that Boltzmann was just one voice among many trying to answer that question. As I point out in the beginning of this new book, C.S. Lewis was doing the same thing at the exact same time that Boltzmann was with his Mere Christianity, and I began to see that conservative evangelicals were also engaged in a quest for the essence, even if they may not ever acknowledge that. And then I realized that questing for the essence is a function of just being Christian in modernity. And at that point, the book just sort of fell into place. And so it really all does begin with my Boltzmann work, where I first worked through some of these questions. And then once I broadened the picture, kept stepping a little bit further and further back, you begin to see a pattern, and you start to see that the same questions appear all over the place. It was interesting for me to, looking at James Cone's work, from this angle, I thought, oh, he does refer to the essence of Christianity in his work. This comes up explicitly in his writings, and it's the kind of thing that if you're not attuned to this set of questions, you're going to miss it. But it's there. It peppers all over the theological landscape. And I would basically in this book, I'm just trying to put the pieces together, just trying to show the nodes and connection points between all these different theologies to see they're all kind of asking the same thing. Um, they might be asking it in different ways or proposing different ways of addressing it, but they're asking the same fundamental question. How are we Christian today? What does it mean to be Christian today? What makes it possible to be Christian today, given all the massive changes that have, completely overhauled how we think about the world, how we think about God and ourselves. So that's what makes the question so important is we all want an answer to that question. We all want to understand in what sense am I connected to people in the first or second centuries? Is there anything that connects me? And what might that be? That's the question that I think all these theologians have been wrestling with. Um, and I'm just trying to give a framework for thinking about how to think about that problem.
Yeah, I like that. I liked in the book how you explained kind of this question in terms of Andrew Wall, I guess, has a this thought experiment about if an interdimensional alien comes to Earth on all these different time periods, and they're looking at the Christian community in particular, and it's asking the question of like what would be the uniting point, if that's summarizing his whole thought experiment well. But that image kind of helped connect the dots for me, especially of like what this question even is, because I think it, like you said, it isn't one that maybe somebody's going to pick up on all the time. And so yeah,
Yep.
I like that approach quite a
Well,
lot.
Walls is
Um,
important here because, I mean, the people who have picked up on this question are the missiologists. The
mhm,
missiologists have been the ones asking this question repeatedly for a century.
mhm,
And there's a reason for that, because they're the ones who are attuned to the question of how do you cross a culture, change cultural boundaries, and still speak about Christianity? How is that possible? So the missiologists have really been almost exclusively the ones to think about this problem. And the theologians have been very slow on the uptake.
mhm, mhm,
Part of the reason why I think the essence of Christianity concept is so interesting is that that's a concept that was born within the liberal experiment, the liberal Christian experiment. And so liberals were asking this question, but they didn't realize they were asking this question.
mhm,
They
mhm,
thought they were asking a question about, what's true Christianity if we get rid of all the extraneous, unnecessary stuff. We get rid of all the mythological, trappings of Christianity. Where's the essence? And that's fine. You can ask that question. But what they're actually asking, what they don't realize that what they're asking is, how can we be Christian in a modern enlightened world?
mhm.
That's the actual question they're trying to get at. And the missiologists are the ones who are actually framing that question in a theoretically helpful way. Um, and so that's what I was doing in my earlier work was trying to draw on missiology to understand Boltzmann, but actually missiology can help understand everything about Christianity in the modern world.
Yeah, that's such a fascinating idea. I like that a lot. Now, after you kind of dissect the liberal quest for this essence of Christianity, you for kind of the bulk of the book, you go on to describe these three anti-modern approaches, which you classified using Schleiermacher's categories um, of oh, what were they? I didn't write
Yeah,
them down.
knowing, feeling, and doing.
Knowing, feeling,
You
and
could also,
doing.
yeah, there's also kind of the sociological categories of believing, behaving, belonging, which are more
Mm-hmm.
commonly used in a lot of sociology and kind of religious studies. But it's the same idea. Yep.
Yeah, right. I should have written that down. I forgot that little phrase, but yeah, that's super helpful as well. And but within those categories, there's the historic Christianity, this post-liberal move to make Christianity into a culture, and then finally this kind of political weaponization of the rule of faith, which you kind of use like kind of a clever phrase where you say that this is an effort to make Christianity and America great again. So maybe if you could walk us through some of the outlines of these. I mean, obviously that's the bulk of the book, but what are the main approaches that each of these are taking, and then maybe kind of what are the pitfalls of each of those?
Yeah, I mean, just to set this up, I mean, the reason why I focus on these conservative or anti-modern approaches is that the conservative argument has historically been that they are not rethinking the essence of Christianity. They are just continuing true Christianity that's always been there, the historic Christian faith. And so my argument is that they are just as modern, just as liberal in that missiological sense as Boltzmann or anyone else. They're doing the same thing. They're trying to rethink and well, they're trying to understand, what does it mean to be Christian today? So as I lay it out, I think you can lump the different approaches largely into these three categories. The first one is doctrine. This is the most straightforward. Basically, that the heart of Christianity, the essence of Christianity, can be found in a set of doctrines, a set of teachings that if you believe them, then you're truly Christian. This is the classic approach to defining Christianity. Um, a crucial piece about that chapter is the transition that I trace between intellectualism to voluntarism. So this is an idea that comes from medieval ethics, but what I apply it to Christian doctrine more generally, and that is something true because it's just always rationally true, or is something true because God or a divine agent tells you it's true? Um, so the intellectualist position, which was the position of some in the very early church, Justin Martyr most notably, is that Christianity doesn't introduce any new beliefs. That his position is that Christianity is eternal wisdom, eternal rationality, just given a new form. That's it. So Socrates, Plato, others in history, in antiquity, they all had the same truth, access to the same truth. They knew the same truth. Um, Jesus and Christianity doesn't bring anything new into that picture. It just kind of restates that same truth. It provides another point of access to that divine reality. Um, that's what I call doctrinal intellectualism, that anybody, anywhere can have access to the truth if we pursue it. Um, the alternative to that is voluntarism, which is the idea that it's true because the church or God says it's true. And that position, I say it largely begins with Irenaeus. I think you see in his writings in particular this emphasis on tradition start to form, where the truth is located in the apostolic teachings, that it's not true because rationality tells us it's true because we were told by the apostles that it's true. And so here you get the apostolic succession idea, which is as long as we keep handing on the same apostolic faith, the same apostolic beliefs, we will be truly Christian. And the moment you deviate from those apostolic faith, apostolic truths or beliefs, you're no longer Christian. So this is where you get the basis for the kind of doctrinal, policing of orthodoxy that happens with Nicaea and from there on. So that's the doctrinal approach, and I go through a few different examples in that chapter of attempts to kind of lay claim to the historic Christian faith. John Henry Newman, Karl Barth, and C.S. Lewis. I choose those three because in many ways they're the most winsome and kind of persuasive and much more broadly accessible. I mean, I could have picked some more obscure people. I could have picked some fundamentalist, person, who would have been much more off-putting, but that's too easy to dismiss. I wanted to pick people who
Mm.
actually have genuine significance culturally, but whose positions are actually much more broadly acceptable or persuasive to a lot more people. So I picked those three. The next chapter looks at uh, the belonging or the feeling section of those three different categories, and that's so where I frame that in terms of culture. To be Christian, to be truly Christian, is to inhabit or to belong to a community of faith. And as long as you belong to the right culture, to the right community, to the right environment, you're truly Christian. Um, and here I narrate in this chapter the rise of what I would call post-liberalism, the rise of the idea that Christianity is a culture. It's not a set of beliefs. It's a way of life. It's a way of inhabiting and being in the world. And so I try to show how that arose, and I think you can really trace it back to the 70s, in particular, kind of that period. Um, and I don't need to get into all the reasons why that period is important, but that's sort of where you start to see this blossoming of this idea that we can rethink Christianity that way. It has a lot to do, I think, with the ecumenical movement, with Vatican II, with the fact that Protestants were trying, and Catholics and others were trying to figure out new ways of relating to each other that didn't require agreement on doctrinal positions. And so culture becomes this new category that really, it spread throughout the academy. Cultural discourse becomes dominant, and theology is just one place where we see that happening. And then the third chapter in this group is on politics, where basically the moral political doing of Christianity. So to be truly Christian is to live a certain way, to be a certain way in the world, to be a moral person or whatever, a politically active person, whatever it might be. And this chapter was the hardest to nail down because I have actually a whole book of additional material that at one point in time was going to be in this chapter. So I have a whole other book that I hope to write that will just be all the leftover material that was never able to be put here. But basically, everything from purity culture,
Mhm.
to issues of, there's all kinds of stuff, pacifism and war to,
Mhm.
there's just a whole panoply of issues. Um, what I did was I isolated a couple major themes that I think dovetail with previous chapters. So one of them is um, the issue of being a victim of suffering in the world, the martyrdom idea. So this idea of that Christians, a true Christian is the one who's been persecuted by the world.
Mhm.
That idea becomes very important in the 20th century, thanks to both anti-communism, but the rise of other issues. So it connects to other topics. But the persecuted Christian motif is really crucial. And then the other one that I think it provides a nice counterpoint to that is the idea of um, uh, basically culture warring as a way of defining Christianity. So it's the flip side. So Christians are those who are persecuted by the world, but then Christians are also those who war against the world as in this kind of martial effort to win victory for Christ, to dominate the world, to win the dominion of Christ's kingdom. And in particular, I focus on the way that plays out with respect to Gnosticism and the use of Gnosticism over against LGBTQ persons. The Gnostic element is really helpful because it ties back into the historic Christianity idea from the chapter on doctrine. Um, and so what you get this nice parallel here, nice in a kind of disturbing way, but you get this parallel here where Christianity is this global persecuted body of people who have to manifest their Christianity also by persecuting others. So that's this kind of twisted dynamic that goes on in the political chapter. So I hope that was a lot there, but I hope that helps summarize kind of the key themes.
Yeah, no, that was great. The great overview of it. As you're hearing, I was thinking through some of the because as you're laying this out, some of the things you did really well was also show like here's where, for example, that cultural thing you were just talking about, you have this term of this can be sort of like cultural imperialism, where the Christian worldview is supposed to be
Right.
superimposed over every other one, and how that politically relates to this like otherizing of like you said, the queer community or
Mhm.
various other communities, and then there's always that blowback is like, oh, but I'm being persecuted for wanting to persecute them, and yeah, so
Right.
there's a lot of those for sure. And I feel like one of the points you brought up that what you're saying reminded me of that was super fascinating was this idea that um like in the first category of doctrine of like the historical Christianity, that this kind of divinization of that idea, whatever it is, that adding this divine authority to orthodoxy, um, can kind of do a dual thing where it creates this naivete about what the actual past was, like the true, like that Gnostic example you were saying, it kind of obscures what that is, and it also obscures the present. And um, really, one of the arguments you make, I mean, you moved on to that in chapter 5, is to have a Christianity without orthodoxy. I wonder if all these ideas connecting of how you would answer to somebody who's wondering what really is the problem of orthodoxy, how you would kind of define that, what the issues are, and how it relates necessarily to those three categories.
Yeah. Yeah, and this will probably be the most controversial part of it, certainly for a lot of people. I mean, I do say at one point that, defending orthodoxy doesn't necessarily require you to hold some of these more extreme positions. But I do think there is something basic to orthodoxy that will it inevitably lead to these problems. It will produce the problems that I diagnose. And that's because, well, inherently within all three of these, the believing, the belonging, and the behaving, there's an inherent ambiguity about these categories. Just because someone believes this doctrine, or just because they belong to this community, just because they do these activities and practices, does not mean that other people will accept them as Christian. That is, we've seen this time and time again. We all know this to be true. Um, and and so, you one of the kind of the paradox here is that, Christians have set up these norms and boundaries, telling people you've got to believe this, you've got to do this, you got to belong to this community. Um, but there's no guarantee that those people are not going to be subject to exclusion, to all kinds of violence and other manifestations of um, policing those boundaries for a number of reasons. Maybe one person is told that they will belong if they believe the right doctrine, but actually there's a secret hidden cultural or political dimension, right, buried underneath, right? This happens all the time, So layers upon layers of norms get stacked upon each other that serve to do that policing work. The point here is that orthodoxy, I think, sets us up for this problem because orthodoxy tells us that there is a right way to be. There is a right way to be Christian. Um, the problem is that at some point you need somebody in authority to determine who's in and who's out. The norms are not self-actualizing. They don't interpret themselves. So somebody has to do the work of interpretation. Somebody has to make the decision. This person really is believing the right thing, and therefore they're in. Or this person really is behaving in the right way, and therefore they're in. At some point, you need somebody in some position to be recognized as the authority over this boundary. And so there is an intrinsic authoritarianism built into orthodoxy that may not may not be evident or actualized on a regular basis, but at some point, when you get the pressure point happening, when there's those crisis situations, that authoritarianism comes out, and that power gets deployed. Um, I think one of this is especially you know important in the case of the Protestant Christian community, right? Because they don't have a pope. And so this is not a new problem. I'm not the first person to diagnose this. Catholics have criticized Protestants for centuries for this very issue, that saying, you need to have a pope. Um, if you don't have a pope, you're going to make a pope, and that's what Protestants have done.
Mm-hmm.
Protestants have thousands of popes,
Mm-hmm.
and they don't want to acknowledge it, but they have them
Mm-hmm.
because Orthodoxy demands it. Orthodoxy requires a pope. It requires an emperor, really. Um, and at some point, somebody's going to be the emperor. Somebody's going to fulfill that role. It might be the boss of an organization, it might be the pastor of a church, it could be the archbishop, it could be whatever. It could be whoever might be, a family patriarch or somebody. Somebody's going to fit that role, determine where those boundaries are, because it's inevitable. We're a diverse and argumentative bunch of people, right? And so we're going to rub up against boundaries, whether they're stated or unstated, visible or invisible. And so that's the issue with orthodoxy, is that on the one hand, it promises to people that there's this inclusiveness there that if you just do the right thing, if you believe the right thing, you're in the group. Um, but there's this hidden catch, which is at any point in time, the person with magisterial authority can decide you're not in.
Hmm.
And that there may be there that can be exercised at any point for arbitrary reasons.
Hmm.
Um, and the arbitrariness is really crucial. I mean, because that's what the source of the power is. If the boundaries were objectively clear to all people, it'd be pretty easy. We wouldn't have a very difficult time. We could just say, okay, I'll just do this. But those boundaries are not objectively clear. If you look at the Council of Nicaea and the Nicene Creed is a very short little document, has a few different propositional statements, but there's a million interpretations of each one of those different propositions. And
Right.
so that ambiguity is baked into these creedal documents. Now, that document is supposed to serve as this boundary between who's Orthodox and who's not Orthodox, but it took the Emperor Constantine to determine who's Orthodox and who's not. That's the crucial picture. And that's the piece of it that I think a lot of people don't want to acknowledge.
Hmm.
But we have to see it for what it is.
Yeah, I don't think people really think about orthodoxy in terms of like the power that is kind of behind it or like the way it becomes weaponized through power structures. I did appreciate how well you kind of pulled that out. I think it reminds me of I think anybody that has spent any even a small amount of time on the internet as doing theology or interested in theology or talking about it has had the heresy hunters search them out or the
Oh yeah.
people that are trying to make those hard lines and so I think there's clear examples of what you're talking about even in my own life. I just recently had a um commenter just ran on a random thing telling me that because I didn't think the rapture was true that I would be left behind and I'm like I don't think
Yeah.
that that's a very strange criteria to come up with this but these like boundary forming moves happen all the time for
Yes.
sure for anybody on Twitter or anywhere for sure but now you're also not only just looking at this historical lens, right? So one of the last few chapters of the book, you're looking at kind of a constructive proposal for all this because you're not saying we should get rid of any sort of norms. You describe in the introduction actually kind of what you're going for. I'll quote it here. You say, "What I argue here is that the rule of faith needs to be conceived in such a way that it empowers a uh, norma normatively transgressive Christianity, by which I mean a Christianity that is constantly transgressing boundaries precisely as an expression of its internal norms." End quote. And so you kind of coined this term that I'd never heard before, but polydoxy. And is this kind of what you're going after with this normative transgressiveness of Christianity and and how would you kind of describe what this proposal is that you're getting at for this
Yeah.
book?
I mean, polydoxy is not my term. That's a term that comes from Alvin Rines, a Reformed Jewish philosopher. It's also been used in a slightly different way by Catherine Keller, Laurel Schneider, and other people. Um, but before I get to that, so I mean, I do want to distinguish between the normatively transgressive Christianity and polydoxy. I think they're intimately related.
Mm,
They're all connected, but um, polydoxy is a way of thinking about the institutional structural conditions for a Christianity that can be transgressive. Um, yeah, so I mean, the problem I'm trying to solve here is to think through how do we need to have norms, right? Norms are essential. Um, is there a norm that we can say is essential to Christianity as such? That's one question. And then there's the kind of a subsidiary question, which is can we have secondary norms that function within a community in a way that is not orthodoxy creating? So I do want to say that there is kind of one fundamental norm that we can say is essential to Christianity, and that is what you just talked about. We just quoted there the idea that Christianity is constantly in transgressing its boundaries as part of its own manifestation of what it means to be Christian. What I mean by that is that Christianity is should never be a settled thing. It should never settle into a tradition such that the tradition becomes the what it means to be a Christian. Um, it can certainly form traditions in the plural, but those should be understood as part of this ongoing process of recreating itself, renewing itself. Um, I'm just basically trying to provide a different way of restating kind of Karl Barth's idea that that theologians should always begin again at the beginning.
Mhm.
Um, Barth is speaking as in terms of theology. Theology begins again at the beginning. I am trying to kind of think about that in a more institutional, structural way. Say Christianity should always be in the process of beginning again.
Mhm.
Um,
Mhm.
and so by that, I'm trying to say we need to hold space within our religious communities, within our Christian communities, for the possibility of departing from previous norms, previous ways of being Christian, and that will be acceptable, not only acceptable, but actually embraced and empowered as the way that what it means to be Christian in the world. Okay. So that's what my vision for Christianity is in terms of its fundamental essence.
Mhm.
Um, but but within that, I do want to create space institutionally for local communities to establish norms for themselves that um, might be more specific. Maybe one community has a set of beliefs here that is important to them. So kind of a free church model here, but really, really, really free. And the way to make that free is, I argue, to draw upon Alvin Rhines's idea of polydoxy. And what polydoxy is really about is what he calls the freedom covenant, which is this idea that the only rule the only fundamental rule of a community um, is that each person has religious autonomy. Each person has the ability to decide for themselves what they believe, what they practice and adhere to. Um, and that their belonging to the community is not dependent upon them obeying an authority, right? They are their own authority within a community of consent. So the idea is that community is held together by mutual consent, not by the obedience of subordinates to an authority above them. Okay. So it's a way of kind of rethinking what holds a group together.
Mhm.
It's not that you're handed a list of doctrines or a list of practices and say, do this and you're one of us. Rather, it's an invitation. If you want to become part of us, you're welcome to join us. Um, here's what some of us believe. You're free to believe those things or too if you want. But that authority rests with you. And are in no position to exclude you just because you believe different things. Okay. So the religious autonomy is the kind of the bedrock crucial idea here within a polydoxy. And so I mean, so Alvin Rhines has developed that in more detail. I don't want to kind of copy his work. You can read his book. I do recommend it. It's hard to find, but it's worth finding.
Mhm.
He provides kind of a philosophical kind of framework for thinking about a polydox community,
Mhm.
what the conditions are for them to exist, what has to be in place.
Mhm.
And I largely think that it's great, down the line. Um, I do think putting into practice will be a difficult enterprise. I don't have any illusions about that, but I think we have to try. I
Mhm.
think Christians should try.
Mhm.
And I do think there are a lot of de facto polydox communities already in existence. I've been in some myself. Um, you know, so Rhines talks about de facto polydoxies where they're not officially polydox. They don't have polydoxy as part of their statement you know of purpose, but they function practically as a polydoxy.
Mhm.
And I think there's probably a fair number of those. I think probably people might have experienced one at some point or another. And part of the goal I have in this work, one possible goal would be that hopefully more people can become, de jure polydoxy. It's not just de facto.
Yeah, that's super helpful. I think the distinction you made between these two approaches, these two ideas, and that I really appreciated that kind of breakdown of it because I think it is really like you said that de facto reality. I think as I was reading through that, I was like, I think some version of this maybe unofficially exists, so like you're saying, but yeah, like you said, on the whole institutional level, because is that kind of the idea behind it as well as because of if we talk about orthodoxy, this issue is this authoritarianism, this tendency towards that, is that concern for kind of the power structures really what's behind this idea of polydoxy? Is that kind of where it gets at of trying to like cut that link between what you think and the the other shoe to drop, as it were, on if you don't agree? Is that kind of the idea?
Yeah, yeah, I'm trying to address the problem of orthodoxy as I described it, which is that
Hmm.
issue of, yeah, the arbitrary exercise of power to determine the boundaries of who's in and who's not. I want
Hmm.
to eliminate that.
Hmm. Yeah, that's helpful. As you're talking, one of the questions I had, you were kind of already um getting to some, but I can bring up that one of the things I was thinking through as I was reading towards reading your proposal was this idea of um how do you create a like if you've created this situation of polydoxy, how do you have like stop guards or place things in place to not create the same like end up in the same spot, I guess, as it were. um for example, if somebody came in with their religious autonomy, but the basis for that was still some sort of a norm that I guess, yeah, I'm just trying to flesh out. I guess it initially struck me as a little bit utopian, but I think with your answer, I was thinking that isn't exactly it either. I think there's, like you said, there's some admitted difficulties in how this would work in practice. But I guess my question was how do you create the situation or this environment, or foster this environment that has any sort of safeguards to where one person couldn't come in and overrun it, as it were, and lead back to that kind of authoritarianism? Because
Well, I
just to
mean,
give, yeah, sorry,
I
go
mean,
ahead.
if somebody were to do that, then it would no longer be a polydoxy. I mean, simple
Hmm.
as that. I mean,
Hmm.
to be a polydoxy, you have to believe in the Freedom Covenant. That's the
Mm,
fundamental rule. So
right.
if you don't abide by the Freedom Covenant, then you've lost the polydoxy. It's
I see.
end game, right?
Hmm.
So
Yeah. Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense. I think that's, yeah, that Freedom Covenant works it. I think when I was reading it in the back of my mind, I was thinking of some of the kind of leftist debates within politically leftist circles about like kind of anarchism and how that would also work in practice and some of the difficulties of like that sort of thing. But I don't know if
yeah,
that's necessarily the same a
no,
parallel at all.
I
I
don't
don't
think
know.
it's the same. No, I think there's probably some similarities there,
Hmm.
but no, I mean, anarchism, I do think functions as an orthodoxy.
Mm.
I think that's because you don't have uh, autonomy in that sense. I mean, there's a belief system there that you have to adhere to be an anarchist, which is fine. I'm not, like there might be a time and a place for orthodoxies. I'm not denying orthodoxies as such. I'm rejecting a Christian orthodoxy. I want
Mm.
to reject orthodoxy when it comes to Christianity. I'm not making a grand theory that all orthodoxies should be eliminated entirely. It's quite possible that that would be one way to develop this, but I'm not a political theorist. I'm not developing a
Mm.
grand political theory for all of human life.
Sure.
Um, I'm simply arguing for religious autonomy and a religious polydoxy.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I really appreciate that that approach, and I think um you know some of the ways, especially that those orthodoxies have been weaponized, have been damaging, I think, to a lot of people's lives, and really to people in the church, and the whole ex-evangelical movement is to some extent related to this. I feel like
Mhm.
where a lot of those people just feel like burnt out and hurt because they start asking questions. They say,
Yep.
maybe I don't think Adam and Eve were literal human beings 6,000 years ago, and they're getting kicked out of the evangelical church,
Right.
and that kind
Right.
of like post-evangelical or ex-evangelical space feels like the people that are getting hurt by this to some extent. I mean, there's probably infinite amount of examples of this, but
Mhm.
that's just one that comes to mind.
Yep,
Um,
for sure.
so yeah,
One I know about very, very well.
yeah.
So,
Yeah, no, and I like that compassionate kind of side to it that looking, trying to resolve some of those issues. But yeah, well, I really did enjoy the book. I think there's just so much in here that's really interesting, and even all the historical stuff, the minute historical stuff that you brought up that was throughout the text that was fascinating stuff I had never heard before. But the way you brought it all in together was very good, and so I can highly recommend the book. I really liked this. I think it's hopefully one that you're getting a lot of good engagement with as well. And but yeah, any final thoughts about the book? Any final words about why somebody might want to pick it up?
I mean, there's lots of little things that I think are will be appealing to certain people. I think I'm especially happy with, I think I think the understanding of evangelicalism as part of a broader conversation here is important to me. I mean, I certainly grew up in the evangelical community, so I'm familiar with all that, but I really wanted to see it interconnected with a broader set of issues. And in many ways, I was trying to break down the evangelical and mainline boundary in this book, to show that the mainliners were often just as conservative as the evangelicals. And in many ways, I try to show that they were the original Christian right, in the early 20th century. Um, that basically everyone has been struggling with these questions.
Mhm.
And this has been a problem for a very long time. Christian nationalism is in the news right now, but these issues go back a long, long, long time. And so I hope that in one sense it it helps us diagnose our current situation a little bit better so we understand that what's happening right now is not some newfangled, deviation from Christianity. The white Christian nationalism, as important as it is right now, um, that's not some brand new thing that just popped up, post-Trump. The roots of that go back a long ways, and they go back into the quote unquote liberal mainline. And so like recognizing that, I hope might provide some understanding and empathy and also some better tools for responding to it. And I do hope, to just that, well, one of the other big takeaways I hope people will get from this book is that the issue is not, liberal or conservative. It's not mainline or evangelical or any of that stuff. It's really about, are you on the side of pluralism or are you on the side of fascism?
Mhm.
Like that's the fundamental difference because
Mhm.
it's the at the heart of this debate over what Christianity is and could be is a question about the extent to which we are willing to allow for difference to be internal to our understanding of Christianity. Is difference something that we embrace and empower and encourage and foster, or is it something that we're trying to exclude, that we're trying to fend off by erecting ever new boundaries, ever new orthodoxies, ever new walls that can determine who's in and who's out? That's the issue. And Christianity has always been struggling with this, but especially since the Reformation, especially since modernity, yeah, we're in a crisis, and Christians have to make a decision, which side are they on?
Mhm. Yeah, that's a great summary of it. That really puts it well. And so I very much appreciate your time and I appreciate this book. I think it was I hope it continues to stir conversations, bring up ideas for people that read it. But yeah, thanks again so much for this and for joining me. And thanks everybody for watching and have a good day.
Thanks, Stephen.